Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Asaf Ramarowski. I'm the Executive Director of SPME, and it is my pleasure to once again welcome you all to our SPME webinar sessions. This afternoon, we have the privilege and opportunity to talk to our friend and colleague, Richard Goldberg. Richard is a senior advisor at FDD. He's been involved in the weeds when it comes to dealing with Iran, Qatar, and a lot of the inside nuances and debates that are happening in the Beltway these days. Over the years, he was a chief of staff for Bruce Rauner and a deputy chief of staff for former U.S. Senator Mark Kirk, both in the U.S. House and Senate. And so he knows a lot about what's going on these days as far as the debates about Iran, and especially also as it relates to what we're seeing as a post-October 7th regarding the Hamas war that Israel is fighting. In particular, this afternoon, Rich is going to talk about Qatar's role with all of this, and there's a lot to unpack with that regard. Those of you who joined us in the past will know Richard will talk for about a half hour, then we'll go into Q&A. Q&A will be done via the chat. All you have to do is type in your questions via the chat, and we'll be able to take them from there. If we don't get to your questions in advance, I apologize. Please feel free to email us after the webinar, and we'll do our best to respond in a timely fashion. But really, without further ado, Richard, thank you for joining us, and the virtual floor is now yours.
That's great. Thank you, Asaf, and thanks everybody for joining and having your lunch here or breakfast if you're on the West Coast. So Rich Goldberg, Senior Advisor at FDD, spent a decade on Capitol Hill, House and Senate, as Asaf said, worked in the National Security Council, helping coordinate elements of the maximum pressure campaign 2019 to 2020, and served as a Navy Reserve Intelligence Officer as well. And I came to the Qatari issue set as a staffer originally, later on as a White House professional, and then, of course, in the think tank capacity. And it's amazing. I think back 20 years or so when the Qataris really came on our radar in a national consciousness way, at least within the Beltway, for those doing foreign policy. And of course, it was in the wake of 9/11. We were looking at suddenly a Middle Eastern war that was unexpected. We were not positioned in the Middle East correctly for that conflict, both to launch the invasion of Afghanistan, run air operations for a landlocked country that we needed to invade and potentially take over. And then, of course, thinking further in the future for other threats, including Saddam Hussein eventually, having a place very forward that you could run air operations out of was something that we did not have so easily. The Saudis, of course, had asked us to leave from Saudi territory years prior under threat of Al-Qaeda and other terror attacks and threats and demands for the U.S. to leave the home of Mecca and Medina. And so as the U.S. quickly was looking for where they could park their jets and start building out some sort of a larger military facility, it became the Qataris that stepped forward. In Doha, an airport outside Doha was expanded over many, many years to become what it is today, Al Udeid Air Base, which is the home of the Central Command's Combined Air Operation Command, where we coordinate all of our various air operations, including ISR, or intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance out of for the Middle East region. Obviously, with the drawdown and exit from Afghanistan, part of the mission, part of the requirements there have declined to some extent. Obviously, ISR remains important to the extent you're able to get anywhere near. But obviously, we still have a force presence in Iraq and the threat of ISIS through the 2010s rising and continuing with the potential today. You have the potential for special operations and ISR needs in Yemen, not just because of the former Houthi threat and the support we were providing to the Saudis and Emiratis during their war, but of course, we have an Al-Qaeda presence in southern Yemen, that we have been fighting for many years. Northern Africa, the Horn of Africa, has obviously additional Al Qaeda and affiliated threats to the United States and our allies. So there is still this need for some sort of a presence. What that looks like is still up for debate. But that's why we continue to be in Doha as a U.S. military. And we have continued to pour more and more money every year of military construction into building up that base. And of course, for those who are familiar with U.S. bureaucracy and the U.S. Defense Department, once you have something, you don't really like to leave it. You don't want to leave it behind. You want to change, even if the strategic priorities shift and your interests are not aligned with your presence. What is the context for that? Well, I remember again 20 years ago thinking of the folks we remember on TV talking to us from Qatar in the daily briefings. And at the same time, a media outlet called Al Jazeera becoming very noticeable and on American radars, being based in Doha, funded by the government family, the family that runs the regime in Doha, the Al Thani's, personally funding this Al Jazeera network, launched in the mid to late 1990s to become some sort of a leading television broadcast news hub for the Middle East in Arabic. Then starting to expand over the last 20 years globally into multiple language, including Al Jazeera English. Really, for anybody familiar with its coverage, even back then during the Iraq War, and now becoming more relevant again today, and we'll come to it, uh, very anti-American, very anti-moderate Sunni Arab regime, thinking of the Saudis, thinking of the Emirates, thinking of Bahrain, very pro-Muslim Brotherhood, pro-Hamas, anti-Semitic, anti-Israel in all of its broadcasts, and a lot of accusations over many years of its reporters really embedding with designated foreign terrorist organizations, sanctioned actors, and not just there as press, like Dan Rather talking to a mujahideen, but rather as an ally and supporter, the information warfare arm of a terrorist operation in many cases, providing material support to these terror organizations. These are things that the Qataris have denied for years, that Al Jazeera denied for many, many years. It was hard to get the rock solid proof on a lot of this. In their coverage, obviously, you could translate their broadcast and say, "Hey, this is anti-American, this is anti-Semitic, this is inciting violence," and yet they still denied there was any problem. And of course, the Qataris will say, "This isn't us, this is an independent news organization," as if that's something that's possible in an authoritarian regime where the regime is funding the news organization. Be that as it may, we fast forward through the years. In the late 1990s, as part of the launch of Al Jazeera, this was alongside a major launch by the Qataris, by the Al Thani family, to try to become an alternative heavyweight in the region, sponsoring radical Islamic causes, aligning itself very closely with the Muslim Brotherhood network throughout the Middle East, aligning itself with Hamas, which of course comes out of the Muslim Brotherhood in the Palestinian areas. And we see reports as early as the late 90s of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed working, living in Doha, the United States on his case, trying to get him, arrest him for already being part of Al Qaeda and planning terrorist attacks in the past. Of course, KSM becomes one of the masterminds of the 9/11 attacks. As the FBI is closing in and the U.S. is going to go in to make some sort of an arrest, the Interior Minister of Qatar tips him off, tells him to get out of Dodge, go to Pakistan, where he does, and eludes the United States, and obviously goes on to help perpetrate 9/11. Throughout the 2000s, we start seeing the support for Hamas grow, not just politically, but financially. We recall back in 2005, Israel went forward with what it called the unilateral withdrawal, the disengagement from Gaza, removing all Israeli presence, civilian and military, from Gaza, handing it over to the Palestinian Authority to govern and control from a security perspective. Then the United States pushed the Palestinians into elections to legitimize the Palestinian Authority. Of course, Hamas won those elections. And then with the Palestinian Authority security forces, which the U.S. funded, still maintaining control of Gaza, Hamas then uses its new power base in Gaza without any Israeli security presence to go to war against Fatah, against the PA security forces, defeats them militarily in Gaza in 2007, and takes control of the Gaza Strip. Well, back here in Washington, in Israel, in European capitals, for those that remember, those that need to go through the Google machine, you'll see outrage, condemnation, calls for economic isolation, calls for political isolation, uh, cutoff of all assistance to the Palestinian Authority under law until such time as Hamas is removed from this government and turns back over the Gaza Strip. There is one country, however, that departs from the Western notion that Hamas should not be in control of Gaza, and that is the Qataris. And all in the press back then, both Arab and English, the Qataris welcoming and expressing support for Gaza, condemning Western attempts to isolate Hamas, saying it's undermining Palestinian unity, sending money. And of course, later on, by 2009, public statements by Hamas's leadership at the time crediting Qatar for helping Hamas take control of the Gaza Strip in 2007 militarily. You continue to go on, and you see Qatar become this major patron of Hamas. And by 2011, 2012, as we start seeing the Arab Spring in full force, multiple things start happening. Number one, the Qataris see a major opportunity to take advantage of the Arab Spring by increasing their support to radical Islamic groups who are themselves trying to take advantage of the Arab Spring and take control of these governments. Think about Egypt as a good example. Elements that are emerging in Syria, aligned with Al Qaeda, eventually aligned with what would become ISIS. Elements in Iraq trying to destabilize Iraq as well, aligned with ISIS and Al Qaeda. By the mid 2010s, the Obama Treasury Department gives a big speech that brings international attention on the Qataris for being one of the main financiers in the Middle East of radical Islamic jihadism. Not the Saudis of the 1990s anymore, the Qataris of the 2010s. At the same time, Hamas is not so comfortable staying in Damascus anymore, where their Politburo, as they called it, their political leadership, had been hanging out for many years. There's a civil war going on. It's bad. Assad is butchering Sunni Muslims. Iran is obviously supporting its ally. Hezbollah is supporting its ally. Hamas is getting a little bit uncomfortable. A, it's not safe in the midst of civil war, and B, it's not willing to support Assad in the midst of killing Muslims, believing there is a bit of a tension there with their own ideology and their fan club back home. And so they look to leave Damascus, and they start shopping around the Middle East for where these leaders of Hamas might go. And they knock on a lot of doors, and those doors are closed in their face, saying, "No way in heck are you coming in here." The Qataris become their personal shoppers, and the New York Times actually documents this best in late 2011, early 2012, as the Qataris even go to the Jordanian government, the kingdom, and offer them tons of money to take in the Politburo, which would be an insane decision for Oman, given the Muslim Brotherhood's longstanding attempt to destabilize the kingdom. And in fact, the king says no. They go knocking on other doors. I've heard personal reports of the Saudis being asked as well and saying, hell no. So eventually, with the Obama administration and the Qataris believing this to be this opportunity to separate Hamas from Iran in some way, replace their main terror sponsorship with political and financial sponsorship of an increased level from the Qataris. If you can get the Qataris to take in Hamas, allow that to happen, bless it to happen, perhaps there will be this departure point in the midst of the Civil War, in the midst of the Arab Spring, while the Obama administration continues to pine for Palestinian unity to try to get Hamas out of control and back inside the Palestinian Authority. Those negotiations never really stopped during the Obama administration, certainly in the late first term. I was on Capitol Hill fighting a lot of this with the State Department. And so they said the Qataris, yes, you take them. You already are their friend. We'll be fine with it, and we'll help you. And maybe this will be a great opportunity to turn Hamas more moderate and get Palestinian unity, which we want to pave the way to a two-state solution. That's how the Qataris end up in Doha, as you see them today. Fast forward to through the 2010s, there becomes a culture shift, both in Washington and in Israel. This was not a popular decision at first. There is a lot of commentary and articles and press coverage of Israeli leaders opposing the Qataris being allowed to take in Hamas leadership for many years. There is coverage of folks in Washington saying this is outrageous. We shouldn't allow this to happen. At some point, something just changes in the psyche in Jerusalem and in Washington, where we all sort of look the other way and forget who the Qataris are, what they have done for 20 years, and say, okay, well, what else are we supposed to do? Hamas is in control of Gaza. We just keep having these wars every 2 years. The rocket flow, the Iranians keep supplying them with weapons. There has to be a different pathway here. Who else is going to go into Gaza and help to prevent a humanitarian catastrophe, which will fall on Israel's doorstep? Israel has the Iron Dome now. It can deal with the threat from Hamas. So the strategy has changed. Instead of being on a war footing where we need to defeat Hamas, we're now in a containment posture where we just need to keep Hamas in Gaza, allow the Qataris to come in and help population, pour money into infrastructure projects, pour money into paying government civil servants, effectively subsidize Hamas in Gaza alongside the United Nations, primarily UNRWA, the UN Relief and Works Agency, to again subsidize all of Hamas's rule. And this will all work out well. Hamas will become this responsible government. Never going to stop being a jihadist terrorist organization. It's never going to break with Iran. But we have a new equilibrium where there is a threat. We know how to deal with it. It's in Gaza. There's an Iron Dome. The Qataris are a moderating force. They can intervene on our behalf to rein back Hamas when we need them, not just relying on the Egyptians as Israel had in the past. And this would be the new status quo. And in fact, the level of support from Qatar to Hamas increases over the last 7 or so years. A lot of money going in, not just suitcases of cash that the Hamas leadership used to be filmed in crossing back from Egypt into Gaza after having gone to visit folks in Doha or elsewhere. But now formalized institutional transfers of money to provide support in Gaza. Now, what happened to all that money? What happened to a lot of this? We know a lot of this became diverted resources into hundreds of miles of tunnel infrastructure alongside the UN subsidies as well, effectively supporting what would become a metastasized threat that Israel did not expect, that we didn't expect, that we should have known at some point would come, aligned and coordinated with the rest of Iran's terror axis to unleash what we now see as October 7th. Okay, so we wake up on October 7th and we see this giant massacre occur. And we are forced to evaluate, where are we today? What is our current posture towards the Qataris today? What is the Qatari current posture towards Hamas today? Well, the Politburo lives large in Doha, in five-star hotels. Other Hamas leaders come in and out. The Iranians come in and out of Doha to meet with Hamas and coordinate with Hamas, carrying messages from Doha eventually to Beirut, to Hezbollah, to Syria, to Assad, and elsewhere in the network. You have Al Jazeera, which is continuing, never really stopped over the last 30 years, pumping out anti-Semitism, anti-Americanism, anti-moderate Sunni governmentism in its broadcasts. And now, for its bureau in Gaza, for its reporters in Gaza, senior folks like the deputy bureau chief, we learn, in fact, that they aren't just reporters on the ground, but are Hamas operatives, now unmasked after their deaths. And we didn't need that proof to know that Al Jazeera was already providing material support to Hamas. We've seen throughout this conflict since October 7th, reporters on the ground embedded with Hamas going on their operations, filming their fighting back against Israeli troops, and then broadcasting that on Al Jazeera. We've even seen the pictures from Gaza City before Gaza City fell, from the main square, where Hamas would be showing Al Jazeera's nightly coverage from their embeds with Hamas terrorists that day as part of their propaganda for the population. Clear evidence at this point of material support to terrorism, clear evidence of its actual staff being members of foreign terrorist organizations and participating in terrorist activities. You would think that would prompt international outcries of investigations, sanctions, prosecutions, let alone any Qatari acknowledgement of a problem. And amazingly, none of that has happened. Just a lot of social media outcries of people who have seen the evidence and said, "What on earth?" And so that is a missing link here in our policy today. We still allow the Qataris to host, sponsor, support Hamas today, more than 100 and some days after October 7th. Of course, the question would be, if this policy of allowing Hamas to stay in Qatar, to operate and coordinate out of Qatar, to receive funds and other kinds of support from Qatar, has led to October 7th and would do so again, why would we keep this policy the way it is? And the answer we've been receiving is, well, Hamas took a lot of hostages on October 7th, and we need the Qatari relationship with Hamas in order to broker ceasefire talks and hostage deals. That never made sense from day one to me. And I wrote about this in the Wall Street Journal in October, just a couple weeks after October 7th, saying this was the moment to put an ultimatum to the Qataris. Like the arsonist playing firefighter coming to us on October 8th, they called the US government and said, "Hey, there's hostages, we can help," because they did not want to have to face a choice. They didn't want to face repercussions, recriminations for what they have already done over the last many years. And so they have engineered themselves into the center of a hostage negotiation where they are not some honest broker, but in fact representatives of their client, Hamas, in these talks. And we treat them as if they are some neutral party, just passing messages back and forth. When they want to avoid pressure, they say they are the ones with influence over Hamas. You can't do anything to them. You need to allow them to continue their support for Hamas in order to maybe get a good hostage deal. When there is no hostage deal that is good that materializes, they throw up their hands and say, "What do you want from us? We don't have total control over Hamas. They're an independent organization." And so they try to have it both ways today. And we do nothing to try to increase the pressure, the leverage that we have over the Qataris, to force them to understand now is the moment they get to cast the die for their own future in US Qatari relations. What they do in these moments will matter. We never communicate to them. I know that for a fact. It gets worse. We know of all the various influence levers that Qatar has invested in for many, many years. You've read about it in the press. Billions of dollars being spent on their image through PR. Bribery scandals for FIFA to get the World Cup that you've seen. Bribery scandals of European officials. You've seen the amount of money they've invested into Qatar Airways and their image there, into soccer broadly in the United States. You have seen what they have done at universities with just tons of partnerships, money being poured in over the last decade plus, whether it's centers being brought and built in Doha, university grants, endowments, chairs being sponsored in the United States, Middle Eastern studies, other elements of university centers as well. all to have a greater presence and influence in the academia. You have the number of people in Washington who are on their payroll for PR and for lobbying, law firms that are bought on to create conflicts of interest so that effectively they're not registered. So you don't know they're working for the Qataris, since lawyers don't have to register as foreign agents. But a lot of people who have served in senior government roles, who hold law degrees and become some sort of affiliate of a law firm thereafter, are on accounts at their law firms for the Qataris. And it's why you don't see them ever criticize the Qataris in public. So they have built this massive empire of influence in the United States and in other areas of the world as well. One of the things we learned during the hostage negotiations is one of, in my views, the most perverse area of influence they have invested in. Shortly after October 7th, as there was a hostage forum established in Israel to coordinate the hostage families, to advocate for the hostages, they came to Washington trying to figure out what to do, who to talk to, how to operate. So these are not people who are professionals in doing this. And they were immediately shown by the State Department and others to a group called the Richardson Center, which was founded by Bill Richardson, who recently passed away. Those might remember him, former ambassador, cabinet member, governor. And this center just works in this weird cottage industry of hostage diplomacy, where they will go approach bad governments and bad people and try to cut deals as a go-between with the U.S. government, in some cases when the U.S. government can't do these things. And what we learned was the Qataris have actually invested a ton of money into the Richardson Center, a major, what they call transformative grant in the last couple of years to bring this center into Doha's orbit. And if you look at various hostage deals that have gone on the last few years, somehow the Qataris are at the center of them, when you would think that the Qataris would have nothing to do with them. We got Americans out of Burma, and they landed in Qatar first, and we thanked Doha for their help. We got Americans out of Venezuela, and we thank Qatar for their help. And of course, now we are trying to get Americans and many other hostages out of Gaza, out of the clutches of Hamas. And sure enough, Doha and its hostage diplomacy influence apparatus are the ones advising the hostage families themselves of how to operate and navigate Washington, how not to criticize the Qatari government, how to thank the Qataris in all meetings with U.S. officials. They've brought former Jewish liaisons of the White House on as their own representatives in Washington to meet with these families and coach them before they go to the Hill, before they go meet with the Qatari ambassador in Washington. It's amazing. They are at the center of the negotiations with the CIA, representing their client. They're at the center of influence in Washington, designing PR campaigns to protect themselves using the family members of those held hostage today. It's sick, but true and documented in the press. So what do we do about all this? And this is where I'll wrap up and look forward to questions. Well, I've laid out a number of problems that need to be addressed. And the question would be, why wouldn't we address them? And how do we address them? Let's take the Al Jazeera case for a moment, because I think it's the easiest and lowest hanging fruit. We have clear evidence now of material support for terrorism out of Al Jazeera. We have clear evidence of Al Jazeera employees, senior journalists, operating as terrorists. We need to shut this organization down or clobber it with so much pressure that we force it to fundamentally overhaul itself. And that means pressure on Doha to do that as well. All of its financiers being in our target locks, which will be senior members of the Al Thani family. That can be in the form of sanctions. We have terrorism sanctions that should apply here based on the evidence in front of us. That could be the form of criminal prosecutions. It could be the form of civil cases being brought by victims of Hamas terrorism. I think that there is an innovative civil case to be brought now because the Qataris insist that Al Jazeera is independent of the government. They have, by their own words, stripped Al Jazeera of any foreign sovereign immunity. So I think there's a lot of pathways there. A lot of people have focused for many years on forcing Al Jazeera to do the bare minimum, and that is register as a foreign agent under the Foreign Agent Registration Act. That should have happened a long time ago. It's never happened. But if the Qataris want to maintain this myth that this is an independent actor, then we should treat it as such and take all the gloves off and use all these pathways to hold it accountable and potentially shut it down. We will do a lot of good for the Middle East and for peace by shutting Al Jazeera down or forcing major structural reforms in Al Jazeera. The Qataris themselves, there is no way that they can continue to harbor and support Hamas after October 7th. When will we cut to the point where we say time's up? We're not playing the hostage card anymore. This game is not working in your favor anymore. Hamas is no more cards to play themselves. If the Israelis go into Rafah, if Sinwar is taken out, at some point, and I've heard this directly from Israeli leaders, the people who live in Doha will be hunted down and killed. We should have no illusions about that. It's just a matter of when and the utility to the Israelis at this point. The Qataris must know that. If they don't, they're living in a different planet. And so getting to the point where we say, this is the date, this is the moment, this is the activity that has to happen, this is the tipping point where we are going to have the following expectations from you. You're going to shut down verifiably all financial support, seize all funds that might be within Qatar still, turn over for extradition any Hamas leaders that we bring prosecutions, indictments against, and that's it, or expel anybody else. You don't get to house a major U.S. airbase. You don't get to be a designated major non-NATO ally, as the Biden administration designated them in 2021, and house a foreign terrorist organization, harbor, provide support to that organization, particularly after what it has done on October 7th. Noting that 34 Americans are dead, not just Israelis, and 6 are still in captivity. And what if they say no? What if they try to delay? What if they try to continue some sort of excuse for a long time? We need to face the reality that it is possible there are hostages for a long time that Hamas continues to hold somewhere that the Israelis can't get to. I hope that's not the case, but it's possible. How long will this game go on for? Who's going to put forward legislation? Who's going to put forward ideas to force the Qatari hand to move when they claim that they can't? That could be under various sanctions threats, part of a Hamas sanctions legislation that expands to governments and government instrumentalities is one way to go. You can look at individual designations of Qatari leaders who play any role in the coordination with Hamas individually, whether it's terrorism sanctions or other authorities that we might have. Also, we have hostage authorities newly created under the Levinson Act, if we want to say that they are now complicit in American hostage taking and holding by actually helping Hamas keep hostages, not playing the role of neutral arbiter to try to get them out. We have the airbase itself. We should be already putting forward a plan to move the airbase. That alone should scare the Qataris. The Qataris play all sides here. They're playing the side of spreading money around jihadists, allowing various radical groups to hang out in Doha while hosting a U.S. airbase as an insurance policy for their own security. Well, that's not sustainable for us. And so the Saudis might want us back. The Emiratis might want us. Or maybe we should say we shouldn't be so close to Iran within their missile distances with a major artery of the U.S. Air Force in case we do go to war with Iran at some point. Why are we so vulnerable? Why are we so exposed, so close across the Gulf? So that's another major point of leverage. Obviously, there's discussions of Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act amendments like we did in 2016 for the Saudis under JASTA. That would certainly get their attention. These are all things that need to be on the table. I'll close there. Uh, Qatar, Al Jazeera, our posture going forward, it all has to change. For anybody who didn't know about it before October 7th, you're woken up, you got it, you know what's happening now. It's right in front of you. You can't deny it. For those that were always opposed to allowing the Qatari to have this channel to Hamas, congratulations, you were right. For those who were comfortable with it, who bought into the narrative of a Hamas moderating force, this was possible, this was the new status quo that's sustainable, it's okay. A lot of people thought that way. A lot of very serious people thought that way, including in Israel. But we now know how this worked out, and it's time for us to align with a new policy in the Middle East. Thanks.
Great. Thank you for that, Rich. There's a lot there, and obviously you've painted the correct picture and connecting all the dots. So obviously there's a lot to talk about here. So before we go to the audience, I'm going to let Alex ask a first question, and then we'll take it from there, and then we'll tackle questions from the audience as well. So Alex.
Sure. Well, thanks very much for a very comprehensive and wide-ranging introduction and a review of U.S. Qatari relations and the background to all of these current issues. I guess my observation is, or my question is, what is it in the U.S. policy mentality and the surrounding influences on this official mentality that's preventing any sort of meaningful change with respect to Qatar? Is it money? Is it Iran? Is it some sort of strange sunk cost fallacy kind of thinking that, you know, we've invested so much money in this relationship and in this airbase and whatnot? Is it, and it's too big to fail? I'm genuinely puzzled by the U.S. lack of response to all of these revelations and provocations, the exposure of this, you know, the backhandedness and the circular, you know, the circularity of all of this, and, you know, $4.7 billion thrown into U.S. universities, and on and on and on. And no one in the establishment, so to speak, is willing to change even a little bit.
It is a great question, and is one that I have contemplated on a daily basis since October 7th. And the resistance that I've personally met in raising these issues in the wake of my Wall Street Journal piece and other speaking engagements, it starts with the influence network, sort of starts and ends with the influence network that they've built. In order to really claw away and change policy, you need to claw away at the influence network and expose it. And so the work being done right now to expose their influence network in higher education is important. The reversal we saw at Texas A&M recently is a watershed moment potentially. But I've seen other institutions that have strong partnerships with the Qataris, and they're not going to pick up sticks like Texas A&M. Northwestern's a good example. They have an Altani chair in Middle East Studies, who's one of the most horrific promoters of BDS and anti-Israel philosophy, anti-Zionism in the country. They have the Medill School of Journalism, one of the premier journalism schools in the country. I'm a graduate of it, that has a campus in Doha and a formal partnership with Al Jazeera, which is ludicrous, training their journalists, also exposing our future journalists to them and their ideology and their views, and making them already have a nice feeling about Qatar when they go into the media. So that's one piece of it. And then I talked about the lobbyists and the PR machines and all this. It's a big deal. They spend a lot of money on this, which, by the way, is also why they are so sensitive to their image. It's one of their great vulnerabilities and weaknesses. The minute they see a member of Congress stand up and give a speech, they go crazy. A bill gets introduced about them, they go nuts. A bad story, they're swarming. So influence network, chipping away at it, maybe prohibiting their donations into the United States because of their affiliation with Hamas, creating new barriers for them to be able to manipulate U.S. policy. That's one piece of it. The next piece of it is the airbase, and DoD has strong influence inside our foreign policy. When there is inertia for Central Command or for other parts of DoD, that is a major piece of U.S. government bureaucracy and keeping policies the way that they are and avoiding anything that disturbs the status quo. We think about an interesting corollary. It's not a perfect parallel, but think about Turkey. Turkey under Erdogan, our relations have gone very south, dating back to the invasion of Iraq and the failure for the Turkish parliament to allow us a northern route, and then the heavy Islamism that came from Erdogan, the various purges inside the media and inside the military, really wresting political control that had existed in the military for so many years into this Islamic strongman's control, the deterioration of relations with Israel, all these things. With a lot of relations with Iran and sanctions evasion, massive cases like Halkbank, how is it that we endure in the U.S.-Turkey relationship? Why is it so strong still at a strategic level? DoD. DoD has kept it very, very strong. Obviously, a NATO ally, major U.S. base, major U.S. strategic posture based out of that base. And in fact, we see strong argument now in the war in Russia with access to strategic waterways and the U.S. buffer that's created there. DoD now says, "Hey, look, see, glad we maintain this relationship." So they have this argument and this piece within the interagency there as well. And then I think there's also the fact that they throw a lot of money around into investments, and so massive asset managers throughout the United States, throughout Europe, have a lot of Qatari money. They have a lot of money to put into funds. And so that also cultivates this influence network, not even directly inside the government, but outside as well, in your CNBC type world, that could influence the government in various ways. So it all starts and stops with the influence network and unmasking it. But yeah, I think the base is a big deal. By the way, no one's ever really presented like, here's the clear case of how we move from al-Udeid. I'm working on a project like that right now where we publish something that says, okay, everybody says this base is too big to fail. We can't afford to piss off the Qataris. We have to, al-Udeid is too important. Okay, well, here's all our alternatives. Here's the reasons why we actually might want to reconsider being that forward positioned in the Gulf. Here's where we would go. Here's how much it would cost. Here's who would pay for it potentially. It's sort of like the argument right now of there's no alternative to UNRWA. We can't cut off UNRWA because there's no alternative. Well, that's not true, of course, but that's what they say. So that's sort of what they say. Now, last piece I would note, that I don't want to downplay, is LNG. And it's important for our domestic energy policy, and it's important for our foreign policy. Qataris are very wealthy, partly because of oil and a lot because of LNG. We are right now trying to stop American LNG production and export because of our climate policies in the current administration, while greenlighting the Qataris to just continue to ramp up and go crazy on LNG supply to the world without the United States. Post-Russia invasion of Ukraine, this actually did become very important, and you see the Qatari numbers and the U.S. numbers both increasing significantly for the share of LNG to Europe. If we are going to start depressing our LNG production through climate policy, we are greenlighting and becoming ever more dependent on Qatari LNG in major crises situations throughout the world. That is a leverage point that they are using. It is not a leverage point we should allow them to use. So this is where domestic policy and foreign policy are interlinked. And if we have a bad energy policy, we have a bad foreign policy.
Great. Thank you for that. Alex, I'm going to ask one question from Rich as well, and then I'll go to the audience. So, Rich, you mentioned, correctly, the whole Richardson Center, and I mean, which also brings up the question of also in general, Qatari hold on American think tanks in K through 12, and what we're seeing, on the other side of things, are we at a point now, and are you seeing as a result of everything that happened post October 7th, more policies regarding defunding and deporting? Are there violations, FARA issues, tax laws, what we saw with the Ways and Means Commission that I know you were involved in and whatnot? I mean, is there, things that we can use, granular tools as far as disentangling ourselves with the way the system has been used to turn over on its head and against us, regarding especially when it comes to how Qatar has been so effective with that?
Yeah. So you brought up another couple of examples. You talk about think tanks in Washington, obviously, like Brookings, others have continued to take Qatari money. I remember the Atlantic Council, once upon a time, maybe they still do, took a lot of Qatari money. The only reason I remember that is because when we had the Chuck Hagel battle for Secretary of Defense, he was forced to disclose all of Atlantic Council's foreign donors as part of his vetting. And the Qataris were on that list, among many others.
Right.
So that's the think tank side. The K to 12 side has not gotten as much attention, but we've seen some of these reports of their curriculums that they're funding, teachers that they're paying for, that are going throughout the country, textbooks and things that are being used in thousands of schools, some through programs that you wouldn't know were Qatari funded, like the Brown University curriculum, others that are more direct through the Qatari Foundation and its affiliates. So the problem is, in my view, we have a regulatory environment at the moment that facilitates it all. It's not illegal. It's not illegal if it's, following tax law correctly, if it's, donations are being made to a U.S. subsidiary that is C3 or whatever it is, and there's no actual ties to terrorism that are, on its face. Qatar is not designated as a state sponsor of terrorism. There are no sanctions on the Qatari individuals or organizations that are involved in any of this influence network. There are no sanctions on Al Jazeera. There's no criminal prosecutions being brought to potentially attach civil suits and damages and things like that. Mostly because we don't have that ability, because we don't have the state sponsor of terrorism designation, and therefore there's no exemption from foreign sovereign immunities. So this creates a real pressure point where media exposure, transparency, public pressure alone is creating the change. It is possible to get state legislatures and governors to take actions that could curtail some of the stuff in their states. You think about the K-12 sponsorship, the state can control that. Public universities, a state could control that. Maybe making life difficult for a private university in the state in different creative ways. Maybe you could influence some of that. As far as actually stopping the money flow, creating a disincentive for affiliating with Qatar, we need federal action. We do need federal action, or a sustained campaign to educate people, institutions, of the toxicity of being involved with the Qataris, what their ideology is, what their actions are, and why it's a price they shouldn't pay.
Great, thank you. Let me go to the audience and try to, take some questions here as well with the time that we have left as well. So to Robert's question here about change in U.S. policy when it comes, and we're looking at the upcoming presidential elections. And let me add to that, maybe give you a little bit more leeway to go into it a little bit more. What now that obviously we know all of this now and all the information, what is all this doing as far as U.S.-Israel relations and the understanding of the common threats that we see here? Though obviously we see the how much embedded Qatar is in American society at large versus how the Israelis are viewing this. Obviously a sticking point in general. So no matter who gets elected, it's going to be an ongoing problem. So what do you want? You comment on, if you can comment on those issues, that would be great too.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty clear that the Biden administration is all in with the Qataris by policy, and that has not shifted. And it's, in my view, one of the problems that we have had since October 7th, and we have given up major leverage to get more hostages out potentially and to put more pressure on Hamas. This is the administration that designated Qatar as a major non-NATO ally. Now, a new president can wave a magic wand and remove that designation, and that will sting the Qataris. It's low-hanging fruit. It's the lowest hanging fruit, actually. Costs us nothing to take it away. Still have the base there. There's no sanctions. There's no legal problems. It's just, yep, you don't get this anymore. You did bad things. That could be something that a new president does. DOD is not going to change at a bureaucratic level under the new president. CENTCOM is not going to change its posture. The views of the armed services committees, the House and Senate, and the appropriators for defense and military construction are static, whether they're for or against, and most of them are for. So that piece of it's not going to change, and that bureaucratic momentum to be nice to Qatar will stay. The hostage negotiator we have, the special envoy for hostage affairs, is very pro Qatar. He works, Karstens works very closely with them. He's very close with the Richardson Center. I think if we get a new hostage envoy, that can help break our hostage bureaucracy's attachment to the Qatari cottage industry funding, which is important. So that could be pliable and possible. I would remind that when the Saudis were in the row with the Qataris for several years, President Trump's inclination was to side with the Saudis and the Emiratis. Now he got pulled back over time by state and by DOD, and eventually, after the Abraham Accords, before the Trump administration left office, Jared Kushner was working on mending the Qatar-Saudi rift, which largely has kind of happened. They've buried the hatchet to some extent, and we've seen MBS start shifting overall strategy because of Biden administration policy on Iran, where he's in fact cut his own deal with the Iranians, he's cut his own deal with the Houthis, he's cut a deal with the Qataris in some way. So the region has changed on us. So the region, our partners would have to change their outlooks as well, their strategies to realign with where President Trump might want to take the region if he were to come back into office. He's going to have a very hawkish line on Iran still. His inclinations toward the Qataris will not be positive. So I think that there is room to do things here, especially in the wake of October 7th. Are we going to have a fundamental shift? I doubt it. Could we start applying pressure in some ways and start extracting concessions and reforms and changes out of the Qataris? I think so. The last thing I'll remind everybody is Trump administration did use the Qataris for its negotiations with the Taliban. We didn't really talk about that. The Taliban also had its outpost, its office in Doha for many years. We conducted negotiations in Doha with the Taliban, signed an agreement with the Taliban in Doha. Doha was going to be one of these insurance policies to help ensure that the Taliban moderated and was a good Taliban, ready to be at peace in Afghanistan. And we learned that that's exactly what happened in August 2021. Of course, I'm being facetious. So that dynamic exists, and so former senior officials worked closely with the Qataris. You don't see them bashing the Qataris on television today. I think that's part of the reason why. So this is why I don't expect a major shift, but maybe some changes that can be helpful.
Great. I know our time is short, but I'm going to give Alex the last question so you can get to your next webinar. I know, and I appreciate again you taking the time to talk to us this afternoon, but hopefully you can come back after this. But Alex, why don't you take the last question and then we'll come to a close.
Sure. So just in 2 seconds to sum up, the relationship is characterized by inertia, by lack of imagination on the U.S. policy side, by a kind of masochistic, money-driven relationship where the U.S. has allowed countless institutions and individuals to be subverted by massive amounts of money, and a kind of weird moralism where it's okay if they do this to us kind of subtext. Is there an analogy here with the U.S. relationship with China? Where this incredibly massive, dysfunctional, too big to fail relationship that we know is completely maladaptive and dysfunctional is sort of cognized, but it's taking an immense amount of time and effort to shift the balance, to change course.
Yeah. It's an interesting question you're raising. First of all, I think the way you framed the premise was correct. I think that's a very good way of putting what defines the U.S. Qatar relationship today and why it is so backwards and not changing. The one thing I would say in the China comparison is China is a great power. China has nuclear weapons. China holds our debt. China, we want to run down a list of leverage points that if I'm sitting in the CCP, thing, what do we have over the Americans? My list is pretty long. Even if we can mitigate them and we say, well, that shouldn't be a reason not for U.S. policy to do this or that, or we would still defend Taiwan and here's how we'll do it. All might be true. Qatar is literally like my pinky fingernail, awash with oil and gas money. That's it. Its military is nothing. It's our own base, ensuring its own survival. We hold all the cards in this relationship. Yes, they are a major LNG producer. Okay, well, what is their alternative here? They're going to shut down their LNG production? No, that's how they get their money. They're going to, do something bad to us? No, like this is not how it's going to work. Like we have all the leverage to force changes and say, here's what it means to be a U.S. ally, and here's what you need to do. And what are you going to do about it? Pull your money from major funds in the United States? Okay, go ahead. They'll raise the money elsewhere. I mean, so I think the mindset going into this is just so different to me. Of yes, on like those key points, and then you extrapolate that out of like here's elements that apply in the U.S.-China context or other contexts. Yes, I agree, but we shouldn't even make that comparison in my view because there's just no comparison. There's no comparison. We are a superpower. Qatar is nothing.
But we're a superpower that feels in this mindset in this age that feels guilty about being a superpower. Qatar has there's a kind of hydrocarbon multiplier factor that makes it the mouse that roared in a sense. And even though we all hold all the cards, we either through guilt, it's really guilt and greed and lack of imagination, we refuse to play them. And inertia, a tremendous amount of inertia. And like with so many relationships the U.S. has with allies and putative allies or alleged allies, leverage isn't used, and because that would be imperialistic and bad, and so we paint ourselves into these corners with bad actors.
Well said.
So,
all good. Rich, I know you're on
now that everybody's ending on a high note.
High notes.
Yes.
We're nothing but positive here.
We're very positive. Well, I know you're on the clock, but I really want to thank you again for taking the time. That Qatar obviously is on our mind, and there's a lot to deal with here. So hopefully you can come back and we can continue the conversation. But I want to thank you, Alex, for joining me, and of course everybody this afternoon for joining us this afternoon. Again, I apologize for not getting to everybody's question. Please feel free to email us afterwards, and please be on the lookout for future webinars. So everybody have a good day, and thank you again.
Thanks.
Take care. Thanks, Rich.
Thanks, Asaf. Take care.
I'll talk soon.